Clearly I'm violating all these rules up until right now. I've been, I sort of follow the seagull approach to to consuming fluids, just gloom, gloom, in enormous volumes. I'm going to start sipping fluids instead. What are some of the other rules of hydration?
Right. So you're going to wake up, you're going to start your day and start hydrated. So you're consuming a larger percentage of your water earlier in the day. Then you get all the performance enhancing effects of water, and you don't have to worry about it compromising your sleep. So that's step number one. Also, now you're going to start your session closer to hydration. All right, great. Number two, eat mostly real whole foods. Why? Interesting. What you may or not have thought about is a huge determinant of your hydration status is your food choices. If you look at different foods, for example, most fruit, watermelon is like 95+% water. Right? Fantastic source. Also, by the way, since we're here, it is not extremely high in carbohydrate. It's not extremely high in sugar. It is by percentage, but since it is almost exclusively water you're eating, it is not something that is extremely dangerous in terms of sugar. There alone, probably of all the things we've talked about in the six episodes, that comment right there will probably blow the internet to pieces, and I'll probably get hate mail for life for it. But
from people throwing
sugar,
throwing watermelons.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
Well, I don't think the point is that sugar is necessarily bad. I think the point is that for most people, they're ingesting too much sugar. Most people.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. Oftentimes the people who are justifying the ingestion of sugar are exactly the kind of people that should not ingest so much sugar. So there's a little bit of a user bias there.
The point here is if you're eating whole real food, this is like now we're kind of splitting hairs about those things. So,
so morning hydration,
eat whole real food. Yeah. Yep. Now, important point here. If you compare it to other foods, like actually meat is a very high percentage of fluid. Depending on how well or long you've cooked it, you will reduce it. Remember, you said earlier, over 70% water, right? So if you're eating meat, you're getting actually a big chunk of water. As you cook it, of course, you lose some of that. But meat can be like, I wouldn't call it a hydrating food item, but it is not as low as something like a biscuit, which can be actually like 10% water. That's why it's like dry and dense, which doesn't mean it's bad for you, but there. If you're eating highly processed foods, almost by association, that means they've been dehydrated. Or partially, right? So you're just getting less total fluid intake. In addition, they have also been highly salted in general, right? So now we're in this position where we're underhydrated and highly salted. Bad spot. If you now switch over to mostly, again, just mostly whole real food-ish, whatever that means to you, then your hydration is going to skyrocket. You're going to have a lot. So you're eating a ton of food. In fact, it should be a large percentage of the fluid intake you have actually should be coming from your food, and you shouldn't have to be smashing water bottles after water bottle all day. In that case, though, you do need to add salt back. So we do see this a lot with people who try to make a transition from maybe a suboptimal nutritional lifestyle, and they give up a little bit of the processed food, and they come over and they start having problems because they're not actually consuming enough salt. So add that back. Easy way to do that. You can use electrolytes, and we could talk about those numbers if you want. If you just salt your food that you're making, to taste, that's going to get most people in a pretty good spot. So start hydrated, consume hydrating foods. Step number 2. Step number 3, you want to pre-hydrate. If you know you're going to do a workout session and it's going to be hot and long or one of those things, you want to look for that half a pound per body weight of ounces. So that's the number we're looking for to start our hydration session. We do that, we're pretty much taken care of. And then, like I said, adjust depending on lifestyle, humidity, and other factors like that. You can use what is called the WUT system, W-U-T. I think Bob Kennefic, who's done a ton of research in this area, if you want to read more, look up his research. It is simply weight, urine, and thirst. So in other words, check your body weight, look at your urine color, and gauge your thirst. And actually, you can use those three things, and those can significantly predict actual hydration status independent of actually measuring osmolality or anything like that. So those 3 metrics alone are a pretty good indicator of where you're at. So you're going to have that normal amount of water, plus or minus. If you miss that number for whatever reason, you get distracted, the number we typically tell people is like something like 400 to 500 milliliters of water in the hour preceding the training. All right? So that's like 13 to 20 ounces. So like you're going to go work out at 3 o'clock, it's 2 o'clock, and you realize, oh man, I have not drank much water today. You don't need to go smash tons and tons and tons. Just look for something like that, call it a bottle of water, if you will. If that's not enough, if you're in a really tough spot, you can do more like 5 to 8 ounces, 15 or 20 minutes before exercise. You want to be really careful about drinking a bunch of water like in the seconds before exercise, because you're just going to feel a whole bunch of water bouncing up and down in your stomach, and nobody likes that. So 1 to 300 milliliters, 15 or so, 20 minutes before. That assumes you're in this like 185 pound range-ish. Again, if you're talking people of much larger size, you may need to increase those values accordingly. If you do all that, then you use the Galpin equation for your intra-workout hydration, and you're in a pretty good spot. What you want to consume in that is what I call sweat. What I mean by that is you don't actually want to necessarily consume water only during a workout. You want to consume something that is isoosmotic to your blood. So something that is the same concentration that you lost in your sweat. So if you've done a sweat test, you would then drink a fluid that is of the same osmolality. The short version of that, something in the neighborhood of 200 to 400 milligrams of sodium. Most electrolytes products are going to be something like that. Now, I know Element is 1,000 milligrams, and it's a lot higher. But most products now that you're going to find are 250 to 400 milligrams. And they're typically in the like 2 to maybe up to 3 to 1 sodium to potassium range, right? Coconut water is actually cool. It's like basically the opposite. Like a cup of coconut water, I think, has something like 200 milligrams of sodium, but like 600 milligrams of potassium. So like total spoiler alert, but we'll use coconut water a lot for hydration. Just add a little pinch of salt because that'll bring the sodium way back up.
Yeah, one note about sodium. Obviously, people who have pre-hypertension or hypertension want to be careful with their sodium intake. Anytime I've suggested that people might consider ingesting more sodium, it's sort of it's like putting a target on your back. And yet, the data are pretty good, showing that if people are not getting enough sodium, their mental clarity, their focus, their mental stamina, their physical stamina really suffers. And then people argue, well, most of us are getting too much salt. That often is true for people that are eating a lot of processed foods.
And not training.
But for many people who are already sort of health conscious, who are training, they're largely consuming, or I should say they're consuming largely non-processed or minimally processed foods. And especially for folks who are not ingesting many carbohydrates and are consuming caffeine.
Totally.
A lot of people don't know that carbohydrates hold water, and that makes it sound bad. It's not necessarily that you're going to get subcutaneous swelling of your body.
No, it's recovering.
It's bringing water into your system, and it holds water. So when you drop carbohydrates, starches in particular, you urinate a lot more, and when you drink caffeine, you also urinate a lot more, as you pointed out earlier. So you start combining a few things like slightly lower carbohydrate or low carbohydrate, eating really quote unquote clean. You're not getting a lot of salt in your food, and drinking caffeine, and then exercising. And then pretty soon those numbers that come along with, a gram of sodium in your electrolyte drink are not all that outrageous. And what you find is people feel much, much better when they're getting enough sodium. Yeah. And of course, I should say that there's no reason why someone has to ingest a supplement like Element or something. There are plenty of other ways to bring sodium into your system. You can use a pinch of pink salt or Himalayan salt or sea salt or even just table salt in water, or just making sure that you're salting your food enough. And I think that there too, salt appetite and salt taste is a pretty good guide. If you taste something and it tastes really salty to you, that's an indication that either it's really salty or your salt stores are kind of tapped off. You're okay. Whereas if you're craving salt and you're thinking, gosh, I really want to put salt on this already salty thing, not necessarily, but oftentimes that means that you are salt deficient. So salt appetite is a pretty hardwired set of neural circuits and hormones. And I think we would all be wise to learn to tap into our kind of intuition about salt intake, but of course also to measure your blood pressure, et cetera.
Yeah, of course. If you think you have some sort of contraindication there, that work with a medical specialist without question. Those situations you laid out, though, are very real. A lot of people are living like that. And so it's important for those folks to understand if you are going through symptoms, fatigue, lack of focus, cognitive function, performance isn't there, then, hey, like you may be undersalted. And again, actually, a good amount of blood chemistry work can unravel that a lot. And it can sort of tell you if you're running out of whack. There are a number of folks who are extremely sensitive to sodium in terms of health risk, and that is a real thing. Again, work with your individual folks on that. I don't work with anyone for disease treatment or management at all. I've said that probably 4 times. I'll say it 6 more times. I only take people who are healthy and try to make them perform at their best possible level. So it's actually funny you mentioned that, because I was going to give people my recommendation for sodium intake in general throughout the day, and then I decided I'm not going to say that, because all it's going to do is make all the rest of the people who aren't going to come after me for the watermelon comment come after me for that. So
well, by the end of today's episode, the goal is that everyone's coming after you, but also that everyone has learned something of value. You've already given us tremendous insights and actionable information on creatine and hydration. And along those lines, I'd love for you to tell us about some of the things that we can do with supplementation in order to enhance training by taking certain things before we train. And I also have the question of how long before training should we start thinking about supplying nutrients and supplements for the training session?
I'm not sure I actually finished my fiber. Maybe I wasn't clear enough about the last one. So I just want to tie that bow, and then we'll go to your next one. Yeah, no, it was probably my fault. So that, in addition to the Galpin equation in terms of amount, I recommended a roughly 3-to-1 sodium to potassium recommendation, and I gave you some rough numbers for things to look at. I actually, in all honesty, use probably 6 to 10 different electrolyte companies, depending on the situation. Some of them are really good. In the case, again, like Element, it's nice about that is there's no carbohydrate. However, the downside is there's no carbohydrate. So sometimes I want carbohydrates in the training because, as you mentioned, there's significant evidence going back actually several decades on the benefit of carbohydrate during exercise. So if you're in a situation where you're trying to, again, maximize actual exercise performance, especially if it is either long duration, so more than 2 hours, or extremely high intensity, and this has to be well north of 100% of your VO2 max. In that situation, as we talked about in the endurance episode, you can actually start having a decrement in performance because of a drop of muscle glycogen. Liver glycogen can start coming down. If that's the case, augmenting with the carbohydrates during the training then is going to enhance performance. It's going to do what we call spare the liver, and it's going to keep my second rule of my 4, which is maintain glucose ingestion. It's going to keep that going. In general, what you're going to find is the number is like a 5 to 9% glucose concentration in your fluid, which turns out to be like exactly the number that most sports drinks have, as well as I think that's pretty much exactly what coconut water is. The downside of sports drinks, since we're here, is they actually tend to be undersalted, and so that they don't provide enough of them. If you look at the numbers, they're going to say something like 60 to 100 grams of carbohydrate per hour is the target. And now if you're using the sort of Galpin equation and you're splitting that up into 15-minute intervals, it's something, again, like 20 or so grams of carbs per 15 to 20 minutes. If you're doing, again, an hour-long plus training bout. So admittedly, 100 grams is a bit much for some folks, depending on your size. So I would recommend starting in that 60 gram or so range, again, per hour total is what you want to get to, and only in the situation in which muscle glycogen depletion is becoming a limiting factor to performance. So the other benefit of that is, as you mentioned, that actually drives water into the cell. And so you're going to be in that nice sweet spot of you're actually keeping glucose going, which is going to enhance performance, and you're helping hydration at the same time. So the other little part that's important to pay attention to here is the type of carbohydrate matters. So you can use actually a whole combination of things called resistant starches, which I will use for long bouts of exercise. But in the middle of the workout, you're going to want to focus on glucose and fructose, mostly glucose. Typically at least a 2 or 3-to-1 ratio of glucose to fructose. And the reason is those actually get into tissue through separate transporters. And so what happens is once the glucose transporters get full, you can't bring anything else in. However, since fructose comes in a separate route, you can maximize total carbohydrate intake by using 2 different unique forms. There's a lot of ways you can do this, but this is where the Momentous Fuel product is like specifically has that exactly in it, so it's fantastic. You can use food, no problem. You can use a combination of things like honey and different easily absorbable and usable and things that you can actually like maybe put in a drink to get away with. So there's lots of routes for it. But you want to look in that sort of combination of 5 to 9% roughly glucose for there. So you do need to train your gut. So do not do anything And there's generally a good rule. Do not do anything in your competition that you've never done in practice. So try these food items, try these amounts, the carbohydrate numbers, try the sodium numbers, try the total amount of water. Start low. You can always increase. What you don't want to do is have to run out during the middle of your spin class and sprint to the bathroom and hope nobody's in your way, which in the lab we've seen, we'll just say accidents like that occur more than once. So just be careful of your stomach.
I'd like to take a brief break to acknowledge our sponsor, Inside Tracker. Inside Tracker is a personalized nutrition platform that analyzes data from your blood and DNA to help you better understand your body and help you reach your health goals. I've long been a believer in getting regular blood work done for the simple reason that many of the factors that impact your immediate and long-term health and well-being can only be analyzed from a quality blood test. One issue with a lot of blood tests and DNA tests out there, however, is that you get information back about various levels of lipids and hormones and metabolic factors, etc., but you don't know what to do with that information. Inside Tracker makes knowing what to do with all that information exceedingly easy. They have a personalized platform that lets you see what your specific numbers are, of course, but then also what sorts of behavioral do's and don'ts, what sorts of nutritional changes, what sorts of supplementation would allow you to bring those levels into the ranges that are optimal for you. If you'd like to try Inside Tracker, you can visit insidetracker.com/Huberman to get 20% off any of Inside Tracker's plans. Again, that's insidetracker.com/Huberman to get 20% off. I realized I jumped the gun a little bit asking you about supplementation for before, during, and after a workout, because what I neglected to ask about was training in the fasted state. This is something that we talked about in an earlier episode, but I think it's worth highlighting now. Sometimes the best way to supplement, if you will, a workout or pre-workout is ingesting nothing. I'm one of these people. I actually prefer to do my weight training somewhere between 7 and 8 a.m. each morning, sometimes a little earlier, sometimes a little bit later. I drink fluid, water, and I do ingest caffeine prior to those training days. On days when I don't train, I do, as I often recommend people do, delay my caffeine intake 90 to 120 minutes after waking. But in any event, it's water and caffeine, yerba mate or coffee or some sort of stimulant for weight training workouts, and generally not for cardiovascular training workouts, although sometimes yes. So I'm training fasted. That said, I'm ingesting carbohydrate the night before to make sure that I have glycogen stores that are topped off. And so it's fasted, but with that caveat. What are your thoughts on training fasted? And what I just described is fasted overnight, but some people are training in the afternoon and they may opt to not eat anything in the 2 to 4 hours prior to training, or maybe even longer. I personally find that caffeine hits my system a lot better when I'm fasted. Better meaning it just seems to have more of a potent effect. There are some reasons for that. And of course, we dissuade people from ingesting caffeine too late in the day because it'll disrupt sleep. So I'm not saying fast for 3 hours, then drink caffeine, but who knows, maybe that's in your protocol. The simple version of this question is, what are your thoughts on training fasted? And if people are going to train fasted, how should they modulate their fluid intake, if at all?
What happens with exercise? In the endurance and metabolism episode, we walk through in the fact that no matter what you're using for fuel, carbohydrates or fat, or even other potential sources, the end product of all of those is ATP, CO2, and water, right? So you're trying to make ATP. That is the fuel for exercise. Now, ATP is adenosine triphosphate, so 1, 2, 3 phosphates on top of an adenosine. Well, what you may have not put together is if you hydrolyze ATP and you break off one of those phosphates, you now have ADP. If you do it again, you have AMP, adenosine monophosphate. If you do it one more time, now you just have adenosine. And if you have then, therefore, run through a lot of exercise, burned a lot of energy, you have increased the amount of adenosine that's floating around. Now, if you have a high concentration of adenosine, what's that going to make you want to do? That's going to bind to certain receptors, and we know when those receptors get bound to, you fall
asleep.
Bingo. Caffeine will competitively bind to those receptors. Therefore, that's why caffeine stops you from feeling like you want to go to sleep, right? So we have a very clear relationship between exercise fuel. In fact, if you look at the literature, there's a pretty clear relationship between the more caloric expenditure in different sports and the higher amount of hours needed for sleep. So there's a nice tie between how hard you're exercising, how much energy you're burning, how much you need to sleep, stimulants, which brings us all the way back to your question of fueling. So do I need to fuel prior to my exercise bout? If you're going to be limited in your exercise bout by fuel, then fueling is necessary, one way or the other. If it is a type of training that is not, then it's not going to matter. And so the examples we gave, if you're going to go do a 30-second bout of maximal exertion and you're going to do it one time, you don't need to worry about fueling at all.
Or eating within your workout, because only 30 seconds.
Yeah, you get 30 seconds. You don't need to worry about hydration post-exercise. You don't need to worry about recovery. Total energy expenditure was nothing. If you're going to go, you're going to go practice, you're going to go to the driving range and practice your golf swing, you don't need to worry about it. The total amount of energy expenditure is just not high. In fact, in that case, you might want to keep it somewhat low because you want to keep blood glucose fairly even, and you don't want to bring it into the system. You certainly wouldn't want to use stimulants, right? Because you may get over exerted inside. In all of these things, we probably should have started off our conversation with this. In terms of macronutrients, the total amount throughout the day is more important generally than the timing of them, which is why you can do things like have a bunch of carbohydrate at night, not eat the next morning, and lift and be just fine. It doesn't matter that you didn't have them in a few hours before. Your muscle glycogen is topped off. Your liver's glycogen is topped off. You're absolutely fine. You have plenty of fuel. Even if you were to wait a few more hours. In fact, even if you were to do conditioning, you're probably fine. I have plenty of athletes that prefer to do many of their training sessions fasted in the morning for personal reasons, not because it enhances performance, but if it doesn't enhance or harm it, then, and it's a personal preference thing, fine. If you're going to go do a session, though, where you're going to be really concerned with muscle glycogen depletion, and again, you can go back to that episode to learn of different types, when those thresholds hits and what you're worried about it, then fueling would be important. You would either need to have something before the session or consume it during the session. So one of the other things we like to say here is recovery starts during the previous workout, right? So if you're working out right now and you optimize nutrition right now, even if you don't necessarily need it for the current workout, if you can get ahead on recovery, then you're going to be fine the next day. And the differentiation here between carbohydrate and protein is important. So the total amount of protein you ingest throughout the day is probably a bigger determinant for things like muscle growth than the timing. So the post-exercise anabolic window, it doesn't necessarily matter. Carbohydrate is different. The timing of that does matter. It needs to be around and available so you can maximize both hydration and muscle glycogen resynthesis, which is restoring the muscle glycogen you burn during exercise. I also work with athletes that train multiple times a day. So in those particular cases, recovery window is half what you normally have. So if you're in a situation where you have 2 or 3 days before you work out again, you don't need to worry about getting carbohydrate in before, during, or after. Because by the time you go to train again, you will have restored your muscle glycogen levels easily. However, if you're training every day or twice in a day, then the timing of carbohydrate really starts to matter. And in that case, I see no reason to not ingest those nutrients either before, during, or after. You don't need to necessarily do it, but you can. The general rule of thumb I give is something like this. If you're doing something where you're trying to really work hard, whether this is hypertrophy training or a lot of endurance, energy expenditure is going to be high, potential muscle damage is high, and or energy utilization is high. What you want to look for is a number, something in the area of like half a gram of carbohydrate per pound of body weight. So you weigh 200 pounds. You want to make sure that either pre, mid, or post, or total, you bring in 100 grams of carbohydrate. It's just a very rough number to start. Protein is about half of that. So it's about a quarter of your body weight, right? So those numbers would be, if you're 200 pounds, make sure you have 100 grams of carbs and 50 grams of protein. And again, it doesn't necessarily have to be before or during or after, and you'll be in a good spot. All you need to do then is alter, what I do, I should say, is alter the amount of carbohydrate based on energy expenditure. So a lower energy and easier workout, instead of having 100 grams of carbs, I might tack that down to 75 or even 50 and be at a 1-to-1 carb protein ratio. If it was even harder, more sun, hotter outside, more fluid loss, I might go from 100 grams of carbs up to 150 or 200 and get closer to like a 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 carbohydrate protein ratio. So those are the numbers that I generally go by.
Well, as I take a sip of my double espresso Americano here, I'd love for you to tell us about stimulants.
Sure, there's no shortage of these in most of our lives. And of course, you can cover the health benefits of it later. Maybe you have an episode.
Yes, we have an episode on caffeine, and it does have certain health benefits, although one has to use caffeine correctly in order to drive those. Yeah.
So caffeine is the easy one to start with, and we won't belabor the point here. The evidence is strong. It has an ergogenic effect. You can take it at whatever dosage is reasonable for you. And of course, there is a bit of a learning curve there, such that obviously the more you take it, the more you need to take. Even though there's actually some recent evidence showing even folks who are acclimated to it will still see an ergogenic benefit, even though if they don't feel a big boost of it. So typically that takes 30 to 45 minutes or so, but it's highly dependent upon the person. So some people can smell coffee and immediately feel better, and that's probably working actually through a different mechanism of anticipation. But you can take it there. The half-life of it is 4 to 6 hours or something like that. It can totally depends on the person, so don't let it ruin your sleep. But if you take it prior to performance, it has a noticeable effect on particularly endurance. Maximum strength, maybe less, well, quite clearly less so. In fact, the data are mixed there on whether actually it does anything for peak strength. Although I think most people would suggest that you're going to take it prior to trying to truly lift as high as trying to lift a 1 repetition max or similar. But most of the documented effects are on the endurance-based activities.
Yes. So my read of the literature in terms of performance-enhancing effects of caffeine are that 1 to 3 milligrams, I want to make sure that people hear the units correctly before people blitz themselves out with the caffeine, 1 to 3 milligrams per kilogram of body weight about 30 minutes prior to exercise has a definite performance-enhancing effect. It also has a definite mental performance-enhancing effect, especially when people who are regular caffeine users have abstained from caffeine for anywhere from 2 to 15 days. And that's an extremely rare circumstance. But even if they have not, it appears that 1 to 3 milligrams per kilogram of body weight of caffeine taken about, again, it's not super precise as far as I can see, about 30 minutes before the event starts, can really enhance reaction time and power output, and as well as you mentioned, endurance. When I was researching the caffeine episode, one interesting caveat that I discovered was that if people are not caffeine adapted, they are not regular users of caffeine, the sudden introduction of caffeine can really degrade performance, mostly because people don't know how to operate at that high level of autonomic arousal. Have you ever observed that?
Yeah, 100%. In fact, there's actually data going up as high as 10 milligrams per kilogram of body weight.
Wow.
Which is, in fact, once you cross the 5 milligram per kilogram threshold, you will start seeing performance decrements. So there's absolutely such a thing of ruining your performance with too much caffeine. So most people listening to this, if you're thinking, wow, they said caffeine, I'm all in, and then you just stop listening, and now you go for your quad espresso shot before every time you go to work out, you probably are passing that threshold. If you think about those numbers, 1 to 3 milligrams per kilogram body weight. If you weigh 100 kilograms, that's 220 pounds. That'd be something like 200 to 500 milligrams of caffeine, which is like a pretty high amount. But a coffee is going to get you close. An espresso is going to get you somewhat in that ballpark, depending on source and stuff. So you don't really need to go and blister your brain with caffeine. And in fact, if you do, it's quite common, and in fact likely, that you'll actually make performance worse.
Right. Yeah, the amount of caffeine in different coffees and sodas, et cetera, of course, varies. One thing that people ought to know is that the smallest of commercially available coffees at the most popular commercial vendors generally contain anywhere from 250 to 350 milligrams of caffeine. What that means is that the so-called medium and the large contain as much as 500 milligrams or 1 gram of caffeine. So for you morning large coffee at commercial vendor drinkers, if you're wondering why you get a headache if you're 30 minutes late on that caffeine, or if you can't access that caffeine at all, or even if you're drinking coffee, from another source, you're finding like, oh, it's really not doing it for me. It's because the amount of caffeine in the now commercially sold coffees is exceedingly high. It's about 2 or 3 times higher than the standard lookup tables that you'll see on the internet. So I'm not saying that to demonize caffeine. We can pretty quickly adapt to and form a tolerance to caffeine. Some people never really can get over the jitters. Other people are just fine with even 1,000 milligrams of caffeine, but only because they've been drinking a lot of caffeine consistently.
Yeah, anyway, it's also wildly inconsistent from location to location, the brew type, the functionality. So yeah, that stuff can be very hard to figure out what's happening.
There's only one way really to objectively measure caffeine, and that's to use caffeine tablets. And they work pretty well. Actually, someone I know who's prominent in the podcast space uses 100 to 200 milligrams of caffeine in tablet form combined with tea.
Yep.
So they've now conditioned themselves to think that herbal tea actually has this caffeinating effect. But tablet form caffeine, while I'm not recommending it to outright, it is going to give you the best sense of how much caffeine you can tolerate and how much is performance enhancing or is performance degrading.
There's actually another line of supplementation that we can go down here, which is not technically a stimulant, but it's something I use to help performance when you don't want caffeine. And so this thing specifically, if you're one of those folks who have to exercise at night and you want a little bit of boost for your training, but you don't want to have caffeine because it messes up your sleep. And this is when you can turn to the whole like citrulline, arginine, nitric oxide sort of route. And we'll skip the explanation there. But effectively what happens is nitric oxide is this wonderful compound that causes vasodilation. And of course, that's going to aid then in transporting nutrients in and out of the cell. So it has an ergogenic effect. You have a number of ways you can go about this. Some of them have more pros and cons than others, and there are more and more data coming out specifically on citrulline more recently. If you look, though, in my opinion, the most consistent evidence for the most consistent effect is in the supplement of beetroot or beetroot juice or extract or something like that. So you can find those supplements, and they tend to, again, they're pretty effective at enhancing performance, specifically anything moderate to longer duration endurance performance, and they are not a stimulant, so they won't ruin your sleep that much.
One note of caution for those of you that are interested in citrulline or beetroot, because they are in the arginine pathway, if you're somebody who has a predisposition to cold sores, oral cold sores that is, or other forms of cold sores, that because activation of the arginine pathway can exacerbate some of the neural related aspects of cold sores, and that's because the viruses that cause those cold sores actually live on neurons, then you want to be very cautious with citrulline, especially high dose citrulline. I can really amplify the cold sore response. What about non-stimulant yet focus enhancing supplements? Things like alpha GPC, for example. I routinely use 300 to 600 milligrams of alpha GPC prior to hard physical training, typically weight training, but occasionally I'll take 300 milligrams of alpha GPC prior to a mental work bout. Less often these days because I kind of reserve it for physical training, and I don't tend to use it every day. Maybe once every third or fourth workout, combined with caffeine. So that combination is pretty potent, I find. And so technically, because it's a cholinergic agonist, it's not a stimulant in the traditional sense, but it has a focusing and an alertness promoting aspect to it. What are your thoughts on those sorts of compounds?
There's not much human exercise performance data on those. There are certainly cognitive functioning tests on those. So you're not going to find a lot of information, though there isn't none. We actually will use many of these substances. You could globally call them nootropics, which is, any substance that specifically will enhance brain function is a rough way to think about it. We'll use them prior to more challenging bouts of training. This is something that we'll pull out, say, on the sparring day only, or the most important training session, or a session when you're trying to work on pitch command, or when you're trying to enhance, work on your shot and as a basketball player, or you're really trying to improve a certain swing as a golfer or something like that. But we do not use them every day. We do not use them with every person. So yeah, we will use those. They are not stimulants, but they can be performance enhancing. And another kind of way to think about this is if you're in the case of caloric restriction. So whether you're trying to lose weight or we're actually trying to control weight for weight purposes in terms of a sports where you have to be in a certain weight class or something like that, well, we may not be able to give you food. In fact, we may not be able to give you stimulants because of the sleep thing or because we're already like maxed out on stimulants. Now we can go this route. And so at least like mentally, you're a little bit there and you're more likely to be alert and focused and you can train harder despite the fact that we didn't actually change fuel. Now that's a little bit of a short game in terms of that's not your permanent solution. You eventually need to bring calories up or, whatever other you're training or whatever you're going to do. But it can work in a nice short pinch.
I'm very interested to learn from you about fatigue reducers, and I'm hoping that rhodiola rosea will come up in the conversation.
Yeah, great. Let's just start right there then. There's actually a lot of research on this, despite most people not having heard of it. I think I mentioned in a previous episode, I've used it a lot over many, many years. You have to be a little bit careful of it. First of all, we should have said this at the onset. No supplement is a panacea, right? Nothing's going to work for everything. And rhodiola is no different. It can have a number of effects. And if you look across the literature, you're going to find generally somewhere between a small benefit to little benefit. But not often is it detrimental, with a few exceptions. I know of a handful of papers, that would be 2 specifically, where it may actually reduce muscular endurance. Okay, fine. If you think about what's happening is, one of the benefits that has been seen so far with rhodiola is it is helpful at managing cortisol. But cortisol suppression is not necessarily a good thing. We talked about how if you do an acute bout of stress, cortisol will go way up, and that is a sign of acute stress. However, a sign of long-term excessive stress is cortisol suppression. And so this is a thing to be really careful of, is if you're feeling down or lethargic or tired and you think your adrenals are messed up and then you start taking cortisol modulators, you could be making the problem worse because now your cortisol is actually suppressed. And now you're taking these things to blunt it or keep it low, and you continue to feel lethargic and lack of desire and libido and focus and sort of all these things. So cortisol is not a bad thing. We want this to be going up and down in the amounts that we want. So if we're thinking about, like, for example, waking up, you would want generally something like a 50% reduction in the first hour in terms of cortisol concentrations. However, if you're extremely suppressed already, going down is only going to be a problem. So rhodiola has a good evidence base to support it for that. You'll see actually a number of studies that have looked at it in a whole host of areas for benefit. So something good to do. The difficult part with rhodiola, to be quite honest, is getting it from a high quality brand and source. It's difficult to get as a single source, which is a very, very important thing to do with supplements, is try to get them sourced alone. Rhodiola typically comes in combination with any other herbals or other stuff, adrenal support, and et cetera. And also then getting them then third-party certified, which for most folks is not necessary, but for any athletes that need to go through drug testing systems, you should not take any supplement at all that does not have some sort of third-party certification. So those are the challenges. That being said, if you've ever ran into somebody who's taken rhodiola and they're like, it didn't do anything for me, it's possible. That's, nothing works for everyone. It also could be just very poor quality sourcing. So if you look at there have been a number of papers on its perception of fatigue, and you've sort of mentioned that you felt pretty immediate effects of taking it a few times.
Yeah, I'm fairly sensitive to supplements, but I've started taking rhodiola before workouts and found that I could push much harder, much longer through the workout. Normally I would, or typically before taking it, that is in sessions where I did not take it, I would be able to work out very hard for 20 minutes or so. The next 10 minutes I could get some work output, and then the remaining period of time, it was kind of a tapering off. Now, granted, these are very intense training sessions. These are not the endurance training sessions. These are the weight training sessions, at one time per week per body part type sessions. What I've noticed is I can complete the entire 60 minutes with minimal fatigue now. I mean, obviously I hit fatigues within sets, and of course, you remain human despite taking it. But I found it to be very useful, and I've been using it whenever I use alpha GPC prior to workouts. Yeah. And I've been impressed by it overall. I do want to highlight something that you said, because I think it's so vitally important, which is that using single ingredient formulations for most things is critical to figuring out what works for you, what doesn't, what dosages you need, being able to take things 2 on, 1 off, 2 days on, 1 day off, for instance, being able to increase dosage in the morning and then maybe reduce the dosage and combine with something else in the afternoon. Single ingredient formulations are pretty much the only way to do that. There's perhaps only one supplement that I take at all, and that's Athletic Greens, as they've been a regular podcast sponsor for a long time. That is a cocktail of many, many things, and those are all adaptogens, as well as some probiotics and vitamins and things like that. So I'm not opposed to blends where the blends include a lot of nutrients that are synergistic, but for all pill capsule based supplements where I'm looking for a very targeted effect, and it's not just about foundational nutrition, I really believe strongly that single ingredient formulations are the way that you can build a rational approach to supplementation and also make adjustments if something isn't making you feel better, and also make adjustments if something's really working for you. So for instance, some people might take alpha GPC 300 milligrams and not feel anything, go up to 600 milligrams, not feel anything, maybe just feel kind of they don't like it. Other people, like myself, took 300 milligrams of alpha GPC the first time. I was like, wow, this really puts me in the zone. But I want to be really careful how often I use it. I did mention I go up to 600 milligrams occasionally, but that really puts me on the outer threshold of kind of overall levels of focus and amped up, such that if I drink too much caffeine, it can tilt me over the edge. So I encourage people to become scientists of themselves, and the only way to do that is to try and limit the number of variables. And the final point is that I think that single ingredient formulations are by far the best in terms of changing things over time. You know, this could be women during their menstrual cycle might find that during certain phases of the cycle, they're more sensitive to certain things than not others. And for men and women, it may be that, you know, certain times of year even, and certain supplements might go better closer to sleep, some earlier in the day, and on and on and on. There's just no real way, in my opinion, to have a supplementation protocol that involves lots and lots of blends. 1 or 2 blends, okay, but lots of blends, I think that's, I actually think that's potentially dangerous territory.
Yeah, I mean, just take rhodiola as a good example. I know a new meta-analysis came out just in the last few months looking at it, and they found in general, you see, again, a slight to moderate improvement in everything from power output to fatigue-resistant antioxidant effects to endurance performance. And so it's like, okay, great. Maybe there's a little bit here. Now, let's say you went to do it, and the only way you could access rhodiola is in combination with that and some lion's mane and some other of these adaptogens. And it's like, well, wait a minute. I just wanted to take this to get a better workout. But now it also came with this stimulant or this cortisol suppressor or cortisol activator. Well, now all of a sudden you can't take it at night, or you can't take it in the morning because you already had coffee. Your options are just way limited. So I think the biggest part of all that is if something doesn't feel good, you have absolutely no idea. You don't know if it was rhodiola. You don't know if it was the boswellia that's in there. You don't know if it was any of the other things that were smashed in there, or it could be something as simple as the citric acid they use, like some other combination of thing. And now here you are thinking that some supplement that actually works for you doesn't, and you throw that out of your repertoire for the rest of your life, which is, not the biggest crime, but it's not needed, and you're not really going to know. So yeah, I fully stamped. You can look back at my course lectures for the last decade, and you will see like stamped number 1 on the supplement sections is make sure you're taking single ingredient supplements at all costs. The last part about that too is you're more likely to ensure the amount that is on the label is correct. So if you're taking rhodiola and it says, it's 100 milligrams in there, and if that's the only thing that's in there, you're more likely than not to actually get something close. Now, they're never perfect, but it will be close. If it's in a combination of 20 other things, you actually don't have any idea if that's in there. In fact, there have been many papers on melatonin and vitamin D and a number of other supplements in which when you actually just pull them off the shelf, these are standard studies where they will go in and buy, say, like 20 to 25 different supplements in the case of melatonin. And they will actually measure the amount of melatonin actually in them. And despite the fact that the label says 5 milligrams, they can be up to a 500 to 1,000-fold actual concentration in that supplement. And then you wonder why some people react great to melatonin and some people it absolutely destroys you. And this is also why we'll see this constantly. Well, people will have like 500 times the upper limit of melatonin the morning after. When the half-life is supposed to be more like 90 minutes, it should be totally gone. But we're seeing extremely high, and not even talking like double. I'm talking 10, 20, 30x the upper limit range for melatonin the next morning. And then it's like, well, what are you taking? It's like, oh, I got this melatonin at X store or X website. And you're like, holy cow. So I'm not opposed to melatonin theoretically, but you have to be careful with that one in particular. So any supplement has that to be true. So you want to buy them from as many places as you can that are high quality. And if they are third-party tested, even if you're not a performance athlete, I want to stress this, even if you're not a performance athlete, third-party certified and tested supplements you're less likely to just get wildly high concentrations or low concentrations of active ingredients. And so relative to other ones who you might get for cheaper, but you could be totally wrecking yourself by getting, 50 milligrams of melatonin every night and not realizing it. So then, of course, the next morning you drown yourself in caffeine, and then you can see what death cycle you're in now.
Yeah, and people can look for third-party certification on the packaging, and some websites will allow you to zoom in on the bottle beforehand. It's largely listed on certain vendor websites. Yeah. A brief point about supplement cost and blends, and I promise this will be a brief point. Different ingredients, meaning different types of supplements, have widely varying costs in order to, create to get them to manufacture them. So oftentimes what you'll find is that blends will include the least amount of the most expensive ingredient, right? Not always the case. There are certain exceptions to this, and I mentioned some blends that I like a few minutes ago that are for foundational nutrition, adaptogens, and probiotics. Athletic Greens, of course, just being one of several examples out there. But when it comes to, say, a sleep blend or a pre-workout blend, there are some decent products out there, but a lot of them tend to put in more of the least expensive ingredients and less of the ones that you're actively seeking. And so those tend to be, caffeine tends to be a kind of a buffer against the other things, meaning if you have pre-workout, putting caffeine in there isn't necessarily a bad thing. But if it has 5 other things in there, oftentimes what manufacturers will cheat on is the actual amount of the things that are costly. Yep. So again, single ingredient formulations for 80% of your supplements, I think is really the way to go. And the other thing that I know is going to come up as we're talking about all these supplements is this issue of dependency. I often get this question, and when I solicit for questions on social media in anticipation of this episode, a number of people said, okay, so if you take a sleep formulation, do I need to take it every night? If I don't take it, will I have an incredibly hard time sleeping? If I take a pre-workout every time I train, will I need it? It's a great question. Some people will take supplement holidays, as they may be called, for a couple of days each week, back to back. Some people take them straight through. I myself take a sleep cocktail. We've described this. It's magnesium, theanine, and things. This is not one ingredient. These are multiple ingredients. In fact, precisely because some people who have sleep walking and vivid dream issues can't take theanine before bed. In any case, I've had times when I either forgot my supplements, that's rare, or I just didn't have what I needed, or just simply took a break for a night and it was not a problem. But in terms of pre-workout, I do think that people become dependent on being in that really ramped up state. But I don't think we view all this as like true dependency, kind of like addiction.
Totally.
Right? I mean, I define addiction as a progressive narrowing of the things that bring you pleasure. So, I suppose people could get addicted to pre-workout, but it seems a little unlikely. More likely there would be a dependency such that if you didn't have your pre-workout, you might feel like, oh, you're not motivated to train. So what are your thoughts on taking little holidays from supplements and varying the frequency of supplement intake, in particular as it relates to stimulants and fatigue reducers?
The end goal, anytime I coach somebody, is to get them into a physiological state in which they require no or close to no supplementation. That's the target. We should really be in a position to where our lifestyle, our sunlight exposure, our stress management, our physical activity, our sleep and our hydration, and our whole food nutrition provide us almost everything we need. Now, look, again, there are some foundational items that we can give people. We put together a little bundle actually for this of basic things that you can go look at. But that's the goal, right? So the target is to let your physiology run the guide. Your physiology is way smarter than we are. Even if I take a bunch of biomarkers from you, your physiology still knows better than those few markers can tell me. So that's always where we're ending up. I actually personally don't like people being in a position that they have to take a supplement for anything. So I don't like it if you have to take a supplement to have a good night of sleep. I don't like it if you have to have a supplement to train. We will use any of these stimulants very, very carefully with any of the athletes we work with, and certainly for the non-athletes, because at least the athletes, we have an end date. We have a fight scheduled. We have a season. We have a game you're going to pitch, whatever. When you don't have that, it's sort of like you're in this endless cycle of, oh, you're just going to do that all day, every day. We don't really need to be in that spot. So the way that I'll describe my philosophy is I will use those short-term tactics to symptom manage if I have to. So if somebody comes to me and they're like, you're feeling awful and we've got to get through the hump. Okay, great. Maybe we'll give you something for sleep immediately to get you sleeping. That allows us to then come back and work on the causal problem, right? So this is why are you having a hard time sleeping anyways? If you have to take a 9-cocktail supplement to sleep, then all we're doing is blinding the reason. Why are you in that position to begin with, right? So we see this all the time, whether it is sleep problems, whether it is cortisol or testosterone. The question is, well, why is that low? Now, we may give you something, again, to manage it immediately, but the task, the mystery I'm going to try to unveil is why. Why is it there to begin with? This could be something like this is natural for you, and your lack of energy is something else. Or it could be, actually, it is not a natural level for you, but something is suppressing it. Any number of you've got some infection going on. There's some allergic reaction to something in your environment. There's mold, mercury, like that one comes up a lot. You'll see mercury in folks, and that's causing a lot of problems. Or any number of heavy metals or toxins, any host of things. Psychological distress, bad daily habit. You don't ever see the sun. Like you don't ever sweat. You don't ever drink. We was talking about so many things. So I'm always going to hunt for that, and I hate using this phrase. It's highly maligned for a good reason, but root cause. All right, so we're trying to find that. It's like, are we making sure that we're not causing this problem? And I'm not going to want to give you a supplement to cover up something if we're not even trying to solve the problem of what's being there. That being said, am I that concerned about people taking a multivitamin just all throughout? No, not really. Am I concerned about people taking creatine? No, like go ahead. Those ones are generally pretty fine to just take. But anything else, I want a reason. I really don't like giving people anything in a super physiological concentration or a superfood concentration, right? So again, an amount you wouldn't find in a normal food dosage, unless we have really a specific reason. Some of these things are more problematic. Others are less problematic. So to answer the question of dependency, you have a combination of actual physiological dependency, caffeine, like that actually creates a physiological dependency, versus a emotional or psychological dependency, or just I like drinking this. Like that's my habit, that's my routine. There's a fancy scientific phrase for that, but it doesn't matter. So yeah, we want to get off that. And like, again, my personal philosophy is I don't want you dependent upon anything. I want to create extremely resilient people, and I want to create physiological resilience. We actually have a fancy little algorithm we use to measure that in people. And so we can actually calculate that number. And the goal of us is to push that number higher so that we don't have to have anything. So many situations pop up in your real life that you're not going to have your supplement, or you're not going to have your routine, or you're not going to have your journal or whatever. But also for the long term. I don't want to create a situation in which this is a short-term success that you have to now do that the rest of your life. No, let's just get it out of the way. Let's fix the problem. If there is something, symptom management, that's real, while we're actually searching for better foundational habits. The last thing I want to say about this is if you're only covering symptom, you're really missing signal, right? Which is if you're constantly tired throughout the day and all you're doing is giving yourself a number of alpha GPCs and caffeines, et cetera, even though there's good literature, okay, are you really just using that to allow your poor sleep hygiene to happen? If you took those away, I bet you would actually start addressing your sleep, if that's the cause, right? Or your stress or your poor hydration. Like you would go hunting for the problem. And so like you want to walk a fine line here of going like, hey, look, is an Athletic Greens supplement that big a deal? No, probably not. But wait a minute, am I actually now covering up the pain point that is maybe needed? It's a signal to actually get my ass in gear to go make one of these changes, whatever it needs to be. So I know I got like a little bit meta on you and a little bit philosophical, but that's honestly how I approach it.
Yeah, I think it's really important. A friend of mine who's a physician has a great saying. which is better living through chemistry still requires better living.
That's golden. That's so good.
And it pertains also to things like antidepressants and ADHD drugs and things of that sort. Most all of those things were developed as tools to allow people to move from a maladaptive state. Okay, maladaptive is hard to define, but think about in any domain of life, you can either be back on your heels, flat-footed, or forward center of mass.